Most are aware that the Torah contains some difficult parts, things that are difficult to accept from our modern perspective. And this week's Torah portion, Mishpatim, is no exception. This week's Torah portion begins with rules regarding slavery. And the assumption of the text is that among the Israelites, people would be sold into slavery. And the patriarchal nature of the society is apparent when the text says, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. From the perspective of the text, slaves are to be considered the property of their owners. It says, if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. So the punishment, or rather lack of punishment, given to those who assault slaves aside, for those whom the Torah deems as persons, the Torah's brand of justice is severe and brutal to our modern ears. In chapter 21, the death penalty is attached to such actions as striking one's parents, kidnapping, and cursing one's parents. In chapter 22, we are told that sorcerers, those who engage in bestiality, and idolaters all need to be put to death. And God threatens with death anyone who mistreats a foreigner. And more difficulty faces us as we read in chapter 23 that God promised to completely destroy the people living in the land of Canaan. So in this week's Torah portion alone, we are confronted with the following: that the Torah seemingly does not outright condemn slavery but seeks to regulate it, that the Torah seemingly prescribes punishments that do not fit the crimes, and finally, that the Torah seemingly presents God as a God of war, that God is ready and willing to wipe out entire people groups in order to give his people what he promised them. So what's going on here? Is the God who inspired these laws the same God who declares in chapter 34 that he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth? How do we resolve this apparent conundrum? Well, there are actually a few things to consider. Firstly, when we look a little closer at the text of the Torah, we realize that there are usually things right in the text that indicate that God was working to move his people towards a higher standard. Take slavery, for example. While the Torah does not outright condemn it, neither does it outright endorse it. The Torah assumes that the Israelites would engage in slavery, so it seeks to regulate it so that it is not as brutal as it could be. For example, in this week's Torah portion, the passage which speaks about the selling of daughters into slavery actually provides several ways for her to be freed, and even if she was put into a situation in which she is one of many wives of her master's son, the Torah prescribes that she be given the same provision as the other wives, preventing her from being neglected. Now, as for prescribing the death penalty for various crimes, especially crimes that do not seem to warrant that level of punishment, we must remember this, that the Torah is not prescribing vigilante justice or anything of the like. In order for a person to be punished for any of these crimes, they must be given a trial in which there were at least 2 or 3 legitimate witnesses. So without a proper trial and without legitimate witnesses, a person could not be put to death. And furthermore, we know from history that in Jewish courts, the Jewish courts would rarely sentence someone to death for these crimes. Instead, it seems that attaching the death penalty to these actions was to indicate their importance, that they should be taken seriously. And lastly, it's very possible that God was instructing Israel from within their own mindset. In other words, he met them where they were at. Instead of radically changing their culture, he intended to work with them and move them toward a higher standard. And we actually get a hint of this from the teachings of Jesus. When addressing the issue of divorce, Jesus said, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been this way." So according to Jesus in the Gospels, God's ideal is that no one gets divorced except if adultery is involved. Jesus seems to have been saying here that what the Torah prescribed in the event of a divorce was an accommodation by God, but it wasn't indicative of God's ideal. In this area, God was working with Israel, permitting them and even ordaining them to live at a standard that they were used to, while at the same time elevating their standards and guiding them towards his ideals. So I submit to you that something similar was happening whenever we encounter the difficult parts of the Torah. The parts of the Torah where it seems like God is acting and commanding out of character. In those parts, it is very possible that God was stooping down to Israel's level so as to work with them, to help them progress towards his ideals. But how does that help us? Are not God's commandments written for our instruction, as God said in Exodus 24, verse 12? Yes, all of the commandments of God are his instruction for his people. But even from a traditional Jewish perspective, we should understand that the commandments of God are just a starting point. God's intention is that we dig deeper, that we have a heart that seeks after his ideals, not resting on the fact that God sometimes accommodated us and gave us concessions. So how do we know what are God's ideals and what's the best way to live out those ideals? Well, it's learning from Jesus. It's imitating the way he lived. As Jesus said, he did not come to abolish the Torah, but to make the Torah fulfilled. So by following and imitating Jesus, we can be sure that we are living out those aspects of the Torah that are absolutely God's ideal, the things that go beyond any cultural context and are indeed eternal and everlasting.